At a global perspective, we simply know that the age of cheap energy is over.
Innovative projects prove that wind can power entire communities. And conservation and efficiency can cut projected world energy demand 30% by 2030.
But how to get there? That's not just a technological question of solar cells and wind turbines, but depends on choices made by real people living in the real world. And that means economics and politics, national security, jobs, why we do what we do.
I'm Richard Alley. I'm an earth scientist, a parent, and a professor, concerned for my kids and my students' future. I've studied our planet's changing ice sheets and climate history, and tried to come up with numbers for how much renewable energy our planet offers.
Geologist Richard Alley is one of the 97% of climate experts who believe current energy practices are warming the planet. But that answers are out there, blowing in the wind, shining down from above, and in the minds of inventors and engineers.
Technology is easy. We'll find solutions. It's a matter of making decisions.
Building a nation's energy infrastructure takes decades. Now, some energy insiders wonder if America is still up to the task.
You need to think of energy in a 50-year time frame. And our elected officials are thinking of energy in 2-year election cycles. That's ridiculous.
But I'm optimistic we can get to a world with more people living better while using cleaner, more sustainable energy. And that's why we call this program
Powering the Planet.
Powering the Planet. Earth, the Operator's Manual, is made possible by NSF, the National Science Foundation, where discoveries begin.
Planet Earth is awash in renewable energy. The oceans store heat and offer wave and tidal power. Plants harvest sunlight and store its energy. The sun warms the atmosphere and sets air in motion, and we're getting better at tapping wind power. But the biggest and most promising energy source is the nearby star that lights our days and warms our world. Sunlight reaching the Earth's surface offers about 120,000 terawatts. If the sun's energy were spread around the world, it would average around 240 watts per square meter. Richard Alley brings that huge number down to Earth.
If I walk out into this little patch of this great desert, and I hold out my arms about like this, and then another of me does the same thing, and each of me is holding 2 60-watt incandescent light bulbs, or 10 compact fluorescents, that's 240 watts per square meter that I'm marking out here. That's a lot of energy. And averaged across the globe, day and night, summer and winter, that's how much sunlight is available to power the planet.
Let's see what it takes to turn that vast potential into energy we can use.
Doesn't take a genius to know that a mirror reflects the sun, but it does take an inventor and engineer to make the next step. Use the mirror to focus the sun's rays on a tank filled with liquid, to make steam, to drive a turbine, to make electricity, and you have concentrated solar power. That's not a new idea, but one that a little-known American inventor, Frank Schumann, pursued around 1910.
In his Philadelphia workshop, Schumann invented safety glass for skylights and automobiles. He also came up with designs that could concentrate sunlight on metal tubes, heat liquid, and drive a steam turbine. But in Pennsylvania back then, it was all about coal. Schumann had difficulty finding local backers. So in 1912, he set off for Egypt. His prototype solar farm used parabolic troughs to concentrate sunlight and boil water. The steam ran a 75 horsepower engine that pumped water from the Nile to irrigate cotton fields. The idea was right, but ahead of its time. Hobbled by both lack of government support and adequate private capital, the experiment ended with the outbreak of World War I. These parabolic troughs look very similar to Schumann's designs, though they didn't come online until a century later. This is Sol Nova 3, at one of the world's first commercial solar power plants. Just as in Schumann's experimental station, the troughs concentrate solar radiation on a pipe that contains a heat-bearing fluid. When completed, there'll be 3 almost identical plants, each with an output of 50 megawatts, large enough to support about 26,000 households. While the sun powers the solar car platform, it was the Spanish government that helped develop solar power. The central government set a specific target of 500 megawatts of concentrated solar power and committed to price supports for 25 years. That in turn unleashed inventors and industry to prototype plants like this one. The technology works, though changing government policies and the budget crisis have impacted the industry. But Abengoa, the company building Solar Car, is part of a consortium planning the world's largest solar power project. Formed by a group of European and North African companies and the Desertec Foundation, this consortium has energy ambitions that are revolutionary for both Europe and the Middle East. Unlike some of its neighbors, Morocco has little oil or other fossil fuels. But it does have sun, sand, and empty spaces. The Moroccan government has encouraged the use of distributed solar power by small businesses and individuals. Already out on the edge of the Sahara, you can see photovoltaic panels on top of tents. But the Desertec vision goes beyond this by including concentrated solar power plants, photovoltaic installations, and wind turbines, linked with low-loss, high-efficiency transmission cables back to Europe. The Desertec project estimates that solar power from the Sahara could provide more than 80% of North Africa's needs and 15% of Europe's electricity by 2050. In a single generation, Morocco's young and growing population could go from energy poverty to energy independence. The energy created by this proven technology could generate both electricity and income for some of the world's poorest nations. And updated versions of Schumann's century-old designs and a smart grid could go a very long way toward meeting our species' need for energy. Collecting just 10% of the sun's energy from a 600-mile square of low-latitude desert would supply roughly twice today's human consumption of energy. There are other ways to harvest sunlight. It's estimated that biomass, plants growing through photosynthesis, offers 11 times current human energy use. And one nation has already proven it's possible to grow your own. In the United States, for every 1,000 people, there are more than 800 motor vehicles, cars, trucks, and buses. If developing nations follow that path, there'll soon be close to 6 billion motor vehicles on the planet. And if they're burning gasoline and diesel, they'll be pumping out nearly 12 billion additional metric tons of carbon dioxide every year, assuming there's enough oil to keep them on the road. One nation doesn't have that worry.
If for some magical reason every molecule of gasoline in the world would disappear, I guess that the only country that would keep its cars running normally would be Brazil.
That wasn't always true. As in every other industrialized nation, the 2 oil shocks of the 1970s brought gasoline shortages to Brazil. Its government, then a military dictatorship, decided to do something revolutionary.
Military dictatorships are bad for many, many things, but the military dictatorship in Brazil realized that science and technology was an instrument for development, for independence.
In 1975, the Brazilian government created the Pro-Alcohol, an ethanol substituting gasoline program.
I think he did it for nationalistic reasons, too, which was one of the characteristics of a military regime.
Although a nuclear physicist, José Goldenberg worked with agricultural colleagues and wrote a paper for the journal Science, proposing ethanol made from sugarcane as an alternative to imported gasoline.
People were quite surprised that there were options to gasoline. Until that time, gasoline dominated completely the picture.
Producing alcohol from sugar is something that humanity has done for more than 3,000 years. So it's not really a new idea.
Ethanol from sugarcane is really solar energy turned into a liquid. Sugarcane proves to be the best raw material for the production of ethanol. That doesn't have to do with Brazil or nationalism or anything. It has to do with photosynthesis.
Though nature may have blessed Brazil with rain and sunshine, it took high-level policy and investment for this nation to grow its own fuel supply.
That took a decision from the government. So it was not only natural resources, but a deliberate attempt by the government, which created the conditions to do that. Of course, in the beginning, ethanol was expensive, and the government understood that. But everybody knows that in the beginning, technologies are expensive. Automobiles were very expensive when Ford came into the game.
And more or less, it worked.
For 10 years, then Brazil was the only country in the world that had automobiles that could use 100% ethanol. That required a complete distribution system for pure ethanol.
And at some point by the end of the 80s, most of the cars were pure ethanol cars.
Manufacturers like GM Brazil responded and tooled up to support pure ethanol.
We were selling about 97% of our cars during that period on ethanol.
Then oil prices crashed, and subsidizing ethanol no longer seemed so wise. But Brazil was still a major sugar producer. Could engineering innovations find some way to build cars that could use either gasoline or ethanol?
In the end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s, we start thinking about having a car that could run with both fuels. But during that period, we did not have a technology sufficient to run a flex car.
A new kind of dual fuel engine had already been invented in the United States back in the 1980s. But in 2003, the first mass-produced flex car, a VW Gol, rolled off production lines not in the US, but in Brazil. Once again, the Brazilian government, by now civilian, had stepped in.
In 2002, Brazilian government organized an initiative for reducing taxes for the automakers if they would make flex fuel cars. So you see, the government policy reversed and changed, and still the policy worked.
And once again, natural resources and human planning came together.
Yeah, here at General Motors do Brazil, we are producing right now 100% of the passenger cars as a flex fuel.
Now Brazilian consumers have a choice, trading off the higher cost but higher energy of a tank full of gasoline against the lower cost but lower energy of ethanol.
And 95% of the automobiles sold every month in Brazil are flex fuel cars. That makes Brazil a very unique country in terms of substituting gasoline. Brazil last year used more liters of ethanol than liters of gasoline. So it's not a small experiment, it's a large experiment.
Brazilian researchers claim they could expand their nation's production of biofuel 10 times over, using only abandoned farmland and underutilized pastures, while still protecting the nation's forests.
Biofuels will only be a sustainable alternative not only if they do not compete with the production of food, but also if they do not cause harm to the environment.
Looking back, it may seem like a straight path from imported oil to energy independence. But the Pro-Al-Cool program was an on-again, off-again process before ending up with flex cars using flex fuels. What was constant was a nation focusing on its unique capabilities and natural resources, assets that inevitably vary nation by nation. For José Goldenberg, present at the creation of the push for sugarcane ethanol, the story has one main lesson.
You have to adopt the solution and then have the courage to stick to it.
Are there other examples of communities and nations that have begun the transition away from fossil fuels? What does it take to welcome the turbines and solar farms of the new energy system and say, yes, in my backyard? This is the story of two communities that at first look very different. Samsa is a small island off the Danish mainland. West Texas is a vast, dry expanse in America's south. What both have is abundant wind. At times, Samsa produces more electricity than it uses, exporting surplus power to the Danish mainland. And Texas wind now generates as much power as the next 3 U.S. states combined. Samsa and West Texas both solved the NIMBY, not in my backyard challenge, that has stymied so many renewable energy projects. It's not easy, but with patience and persistence and the efforts of the right people, it can be done.
Okay.
My name is Søren Hermansen, and I'm the director of the Samsø Energy Academy. Samsø means in Danish means the meeting island. When you make a circle around all of Denmark, then Samsø is right in the center of the circle.
But it wasn't geography that brought Lurke Friis, then Denmark's Minister of Climate and Energy, here in mid-2011. It was why and how this community had turned NIMBY into yes in my backyard.
Well, Samsø is a pioneering project in a sense that Samsø way back decided that Samsø should become independent of fossil fuels.
Before its transformation, people thought of Samsa as just a cute tourist community, busy in summer, empty and desolate in winter. Now people come here not just to see the turbines, but to understand the process that got the community to welcome wind energy. After a national competition, Samsa was selected by the Danish government to be a proof of concept for how to transition from fossil fuels. But it was up to individuals like Søren Hermansen with the passion and skills to effect change, to figure out just how.
So when we won, the normal reaction from most people was that, yeah, you can do this project, that's okay, but just leave me out of it.
Samsa has a deep attachment to its past and values its traditional way of life.
But gradually we won their confidence in establishing easy projects to understand and also easy projects to finance, because basically it's all about what's in it for me, because it's not convinced idealist or green environmental hippies who lives here.
Søren, a native of the island, convinced some of his neighbors to become early adopters. They found success and spread the word. Jørn Tranbier operated a large and profitable herd of milk cows. After initial reservations, he invested in a turbine on his own land. When that went well, Jørn became part owner of one of the offshore turbines.
Farmers, they have to invent new things and be ready for changes. So when they see a potential, they look at it, no matter what it is. They look at it and say, could I do this? And if they see fellow farmers do the same thing, they're very quick to respond to that. So even being very traditional and conservative in their heads, I think they have this ability of making moves and do things because they have this independency in them. A farmer is a free man. Maybe he owes a lot of money to the bank, but he's still a free man in his thinking.
It was seeing what was in it for them and for their community that won over landowners in West Texas. And it took one of their own, a man whose family had deep roots in Roscoe's cotton fields, to educate them about wind farming.
Well, I'm really a farmer. You see, I farmed for almost 40 years. We're in the right in the middle of the Roscoe wind farm, and we've got about 780 megawatts of production. That's per hour, enough electricity for about 265,000 average homes.
Roscoe had no oil and faced hard times in the early 90s, but it did have wind.
When this land was acquired, there was absolutely no value to the wind. Fact is, it was a severe detriment because of the evaporation of the moisture.
Cliff, like CERN, had to work with his neighbors to get them ready to accept wind turbines.
The first thing farmers want to know is, well, how much is it going to cost me? Cost them nothing. What's it going to hurt? 3 to 5% of your farmland is all it's going to take up. You can do what you want to with the rest of it. Then it came down to, well, how much money is this going to make me?
Cliff did his research and checked his numbers with wind experts and the Farm Bureau.
Then I was able to go to our landowner association and show them where they had been receiving $35 to $40 an acre. Then the landowners could expect somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 times that.
In fact, farmers stand to make $10,000 to $15,000 a year per turbine just from leasing the wind rights.
There was no guarantees in it from the very beginning, but sure enough, we've got, I think, in the neighborhood of 95 or more % of our area that accepted the wind farm.
In both SAMHSA and West Texas, individuals saw economic benefits. But the whole community, beyond the investors and landowners, benefited too.
Because of the wind farm now and the people working in the wind industry, now we've got jobs available and opportunities for young people to come back from college or from technical school or from whatever. It's just been a godsend.
For Kim Alexander, superintendent of the Roscoe School District, that godsend translates into dollars.
In 2007, prior to the wind values coming on our tax roll, our property values were at about $65 million. And then that wind development, they jumped approximately $400 million to $465 million.
The school district will get more than $10 million over a decade. That guaranteed revenue stream unlocked additional funding. School buildings, some dating from the 1930s, could be updated, and computer labs added.
This is an indication to me of what can be done for rural areas and will be done all the way to Canada, bringing life and prosperity and back to these rural communities that are suffering just like we have.
The same oil shock that got Brazil started on ethanol got Denmark started on manufacturing wind turbines just in time to compensate for a decline in its shipbuilding industry.
And it's also good for the economy in terms of export. I mean, 10% of Danish exports comes from the clean tech area.
Energy and environment always require trade-offs, such as clear vistas versus clean energy. It's something that communities have to make time to work through. Cliff, for one, believes it's worth it.
Everything, the schools, the churches, the civic organizations, all the businesses will benefit from this. It'll increase, hopefully, our town's populations and our economics.
My granddad used to just say, not realizing he was prophetic, but you know, if we could sell the wind, we'd be wealthy. Well, who would have ever thought we'd be able to sell the wind?
For SAMHSA, Denmark, and Texas, clean energy brought economic benefits and energy security. But replacing fossil fuel emissions with wind power has other advantages.
And let's not forget, also good for climate and health as such. And that's a very important argument.
We've got a constant wind resource here that's tremendously valuable, and as opposed to oil and gas, it'll last forever. And it doesn't pollute anything.
then repeating 180, 280, the natural cycling of the climate roller coaster. But if we look in greater detail at 100,000 years of Earth history, and specifically at the ice core record from Greenland, it's obvious our planet's climate hasn't always had smooth ups and downs.
Occasionally, we cross some sort of a tipping point, and the Earth evolves really rapidly to a new state, which is very different. Over the last 100,000 years of the Ice Age cycling, we've had a couple of dozen of these large, abrupt, widespread climate shifts.
Almost as if the Earth was bungee jumping off the climate roller coaster. Of course, you'd have to be a little nuts to bungee off a roller coaster, which is why I'm leaving this to my computer avatar. But these abrupt climate changes are real. Here's one of the largest and most recent. About 13,000 years ago, as the Earth was climbing out of the last ice age, the North passed a tipping point and rapidly slid back into a cold millennium. Drying monsoon regions of Asia where huge populations now rely on rain, and warming the South. There was weather and climate disruption worldwide. But then another tipping point was reached, and in 10 years or so, temperatures in Greenland rose by about 10 degrees centigrade, 18 Fahrenheit, numbers we know with high confidence from the ice core record. Today, whatever climate model we use to project the impact of rising levels of CO2, you see a relatively smooth curve, heading upward, but in principle a change we could adapt to. But Earth's history shows us that Earth's climate doesn't always work this way. Sometimes it really does get as crazy and unpredictable as bungee jumping off the climate roller coaster. An abrupt climate change could be really bad for people. We're optimistic that we won't have one, but we're not certain. And the science suggests that the harder and faster we turn the CO2 knob, the more likely we are to cross a tipping point and trigger one. Yet here we are today, racing up a hill to who knows where. As burning fossil fuels means we've blown past 390 parts per million without slowing down. Will our ascent be smooth and manageable, or will our ride come off the rails? If we wanted to take out insurance against the possibility of such a change, we could look at slowing down now before we tip over the edge.
One way of ensuring a more manageable climate is to research and deploy ways to burn fossil fuels without releasing massive amounts of carbon dioxide. And surprising as it may be, some of the most innovative work to meet that urgent 21st century goal is happening in the land of one of Earth's most ancient empires. China was first unified as a nation in the 3rd century BC by the emperor who had this army of terracotta warriors built to guard his tomb. These figures represent state control and mass production in the service of a master plan, extending from this life into the hereafter. This is a wonder of the ancient world. But when China wanted to showcase its national treasures for a contemporary audience, it placed one of the emperor's majestic chariots as a centerpiece at the 2010 Shanghai World Expo. This expo, however, was focused more on the future than the past. One entire floor of the massive Chinese pavilion was devoted to renewable energy and low-carbon living. Here, there was no doubt that CO2 emissions were driving climate change, and that clean energy was the solution. All world's fairs are exercises in self-promotion, if not propaganda. But hard numbers tell the story. In 2010, China invested more on renewable energy than any other nation on Earth. Germany was number 2, and the U.S. number 3, committing roughly half as much as China.
China is being aggressive on all the clean energy fronts. They're building 100,000 megawatts of wind. They're putting up 10,000 megawatts of solar PV, 50,000 megawatts of nuclear.
At the U.S. Department of Energy's Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory in California, geoscientist Julio Friedman is in charge of its carbon management program. He uses some of the world's fastest supercomputers to study how to store CO2 underground. And he's an expert on U.S.-China energy collaboration.
They're not putting all their eggs in one basket either. They're trying to cover comprehensively all the clean energy options.
And that includes an old and dirty fuel that China both mines and imports at world record levels.
China is the world's largest coal producer. It's the world's largest coal user. They're not going to abandon coal anytime soon.
The city of Xi'an is home to the Terracotta Warriors and was once the capital of China, starting point for the Silk Road. Now it's a modern city that illustrates the forces that will shape China's energy future and inevitably impact the entire planet. Xi'an is also home to the Thermal Power Research Institute, TPRI. Thermal power in China is shorthand for coal, which supplies 3/4 of this nation's electricity supply. In the U.S., it's about half, and worldwide, burning coal produces about 1/4 of all greenhouse gas emissions.
If you look in the past, coal is mighty, built our country. It is filthy, soiled our land and atmospheres. In the future, I think coal can be mighty and can be clean and can be benign.
Clean coal may seem like a contradiction, but if it's real, it has implications not just for China, but also for the U.S. and many developing nations. TPRI is owned by Huaneng Power, one of the largest utilities in the world. They've renamed this key national laboratory the Clean Energy Research Institute. Xu Xishen is the director.
Coal-fired power plants account for 74% of China's energy production. It's the main source of power generation.
Coal is dirty, but cheap and abundant. The Institute's new mission is to develop innovative technologies and processes that can burn this hydrocarbon in cleaner, safer ways.
Coal is half of the world's power today. It's half of the emissions that the U.S. and China put into the atmosphere. We just have to tackle coal directly. There is no solution to climate change that doesn't involve China reassessing its coal markets and its coal conversion technology. And they're doing that.
China started researching and developing clean coal technology back in the early 1990s.
Technology developed at the Institute is used in this pilot carbon sequestration facility outside Shanghai. It's attached to the giant Shidangkou No. 2 generating station, also owned by Huaneng Power. This plant uses a process called post-combustion capture, PCC, where coal is first burned in a more or less traditional manner, and then the CO2 is captured.
So Shidangkou is remarkable in every way. They're capturing 150,000 tons of carbon dioxide, and they've been doing that now for about 18 months successfully.
Shidangkou sells the captured CO2 for use in soft drinks and chemicals, turning it into a resource. In the future, they'll scale up and begin sequestering the CO2 deep underground.
Already that means that it works and that the cost and performance are pretty well understood. So if it can be widely applied, then it creates the new benchmark that will define whether or not this works anywhere else.
If this new technology works, any existing coal plant can be retrofitted and run more cleanly.
But it is more about the economic feasibility because the cost is very high, which increases the price of electricity by about 20%.
Nobody wants to pay more for power, but nobody wants to have contaminated rivers and skies. If we can pay 20% more to get carbon capture and sequestration deployed at scale in today's fleet, I would be a very, very happy guy if we could get away from that.
Shidangkou No. 2 demonstrates what can be done at many older power plants. But the GreenGen construction site near Tianjin, about 70 miles south of Beijing, represents a completely new approach to turning coal into energy with minimal pollution and emissions.
buildings up, air separation.
Albert Lin is an American venture capitalist. Together with his colleague Bill Douglas from Houston, Texas, they've licensed Huaneng technology for what they hope will be a clean coal plant in Pennsylvania. They visited GreenGen in July 2010.
A year and a half ago when I was here, this was just cleared land. And so this kind of a project of this size at this pace is unprecedented.
By October 2011, the physical structure was completed, with commissioning tests ongoing.
This is the world's most advanced coal gasifier.
This structure, at the heart of GreenGen, burns coal, converted into what's called syngas, and emits far fewer pollutants than a traditional plant.
The ultimate goal for GreenGen is to generate 400 megawatt of electricity. At the same time, we want to capture 90% of the CO2.
Once GreenGen is fully operational, the CO2 will be pumped offshore to be used in enhanced oil recovery.
If it works as advertised, and if the costs are competitive with other clean energy, it creates a technology option that's new for the world.
And GreenGen should cost about 1/2 of the similar project plan for Pennsylvania.
It's not just greenwashing. They expect these things to operate for 30 years. They expect them to perform as advertised. They expect them to be clean, and they expect them to be a solution to the country.
It's no secret, especially to anyone living in a big Chinese city, that air quality is often dangerous. And clean coal proponents like Lin and Friedman recognize the harm that increasing levels of carbon dioxide do to climate. They think that paying now is better than paying later.
The reality is if climate were not important or were not a factor, we would not be doing any of this because it is cheaper to pollute and do it the old-fashioned way. But what we're saying is there's a better way out for everyone because sooner or later we are going to have to address the climate issues and the pollution issues and the things that have been associated with a growing population.
I think it's pretty clear to everybody that China's going for the gold. They want to be #1 in all these areas, and they're committing to it in the same way that an Olympic athlete commits to that goal. They're using every resource they have to move ahead for their population's needs and for their economy's needs.
China's breakneck development may seem chaotic, but behind the seeming chaos, there's literally a plan in their energy policies. China's 12th five-year plan, announced in 2011, set ambitious goals for how much power must be generated by renewable energy. Of course, top-down direction is easier in an authoritarian state. But CO2 emissions per unit of economic output are targeted for a 17% reduction by 2015.
I think the most important thing to learn from what China is doing these days is that it's good to have a plan. You can quibble with their plan, but they have one. Having that plan, having that long arc of commitment is what's really going to deliver the goods.
Will the result of all China's plans and incentives and subsidies be more blue sky days, where traditions endure and people eventually enjoy cleaner air? Will sustained policy and state planning result in abundant energy and technological achievements to rival those of the first Chinese emperor? But all that won't matter much to the planet's climate if China, the United States, India, and others decide to keep coal and other fossil fuels a major portion of their energy mix without paying the price to burn them cleanly.
So the Earth provides lots of choices for clean, low-carbon energy. And Brazil, China, and Texas show there are ways forward. But can we afford it? Can society make the kinds of changes needed? Well, we've done it before.
Let's take a walk through history in Edinburgh, Scotland. But it could be many other big cities a couple of centuries ago. Here's what a visitor from London wrote in 1754.
When I first came into the high street of that city, I thought I had not seen anything of the kind more magnificent. The extreme height of the houses, which are, for the most part, built with stone and well sashed.
It's evening. Time for a wee bite.
Scottish taverns then as now were noisy places, buzzing with good conversation and high spirits.
The visitor from London dined well and drank a few glasses of fine French claret. But then his new friends did something that was second nature to them in the 18th century, but seems very strange to us today.
The clock struck 10. Then the company began to light pieces of paper and throw them upon the table to smoke the room.
Lighting those pieces of paper was meant to mix one bad smell with another.
You see, 10 o'clock was when you could empty brimming chamber pots down into the streets.
The London visitor safely dodged the terrible shower, but then he was forced to hide between his bed sheets to avoid the smell pouring into his room from the filth. And yet the people had gotten used to this, to the inconvenience and disease, and some people made a living hauling away the human waste.
The English visitor thought all this simply had no remedy.
Anything so expensive as a conveyance for the waste down from the uppermost floor could never be agreed on, nor could there be made, within the building, any receiver suitable to such numbers of people.
So what do chamber pots have to do with carbon dioxide and sustainable energy? Not to mince words, we're pouring CO2, another form of human waste, into the public space. And we'll have to deal with the consequences if we don't clean it up.
Today, of course, most of us have conveyances down from bathrooms and sinks to wash in and receivers for our waste.
What happened? Look around your house. How much did the porcelain thrown in your bathroom really cost?
It took a considerable investment for all those pipes bringing water to wash with and to take the waste away. The revolution in hygiene involved an extensive infrastructure of toilets in homes, sewers underneath our cities, water treatment plants. Today we might call it the sanitation smart grid.
So how much did all this cost? Not that much if you consider the millions of lives saved with clean water, prevention of diseases like cholera and typhoid. Something like 1% of the economy in very round numbers. And that's more or less the estimated cost of switching the world to a sustainable energy system that doesn't dump fossil fuel CO2 into the public space. Cleaning up the cities took decades and even centuries, and we're trying to do things a little faster. But the revolution in waste management shows that we can do big things to get benefits that none of us would ever walk away from.
Old energy technologies can be cleaned up. New ones can come online. Other nations are moving ahead. What will it take to keep the lights on in the United States and avoid the energy abyss? There's no question that transitioning to clean and renewable energy is going to be a huge task. But America has done similar things before. Take the Hoover Dam and the electrification program of the 1930s, or the building of the interstate highway system.
I am optimistic.
John Hofmeister is a former oil man based in Texas. He headed up Shell in the United States. He also wrote a book entitled Why We Hate the Oil Companies, and he's worried that today America isn't making the right decisions about energy.
You need to think of energy in a 50-year time frame. And our elected officials are thinking of energy in 2-year election cycles. That's ridiculous. And it is going to take us as a nation to an energy abyss because you can't design an energy system to replace the 20th century, which is growing old and running out in some cases. You can't replace that with 2-year cycles of decision making.
Other nations have changed. Look around Copenhagen and you see pedestrian walkways and bikes as a major form of transportation. In response to the oil shocks of the 1970s, Denmark turned away from fossil fuel and toward sustainable energy.
And in Denmark, we had car-free Sundays when nobody was allowed to drive their cars on Sundays. And there was a rationing of fuel and gas.
These are sort of things that people remember. And then, well, we need to change.
The U.S. also experienced the oil shocks, with gas lines and angry citizens. And for a while, America got serious about exploring alternatives to imported gasoline and fossil fuel. Here's the energy share of all federal non-defense R&D investment from 1957 through 2011. Investment ramped up in the oil shock, but then went down, down, down. And without serious new commitments, the 2009 stimulus funds for energy will have just been a temporary upward blip.
We're not making the decisions at the national level that need to be made in terms of the next decade and the next several decades after that.
Hofmeister and other experts look around the world and see other countries moving ahead to defend their nation's energy security.
Places like China have a clear plan, and they are driving forward, and they are building an energy infrastructure for the 21st century, which will perhaps one day supply energy to the world's largest economy, China, not the U.S.
In America, energy policies change with each new administration, if not sooner. Since our interview, Denmark's government has changed parties, but now, former Minister of Climate and Energy Lurke Friis doesn't expect energy policy to change that much.
Even if we are kicked out of office, this will not lead to a huge change in our energy policy.
We need decisions that go beyond a single term of a president, that go beyond a single Congress with a Republican or a Democratic majority. And we're not doing it. Other parts of the world are.
All countries have to embark upon this transformation. And the lesson is it can be done, because in Denmark we've had also growth rate by 80% since the 80s, but our energy consumption and our CO2 emissions have been more or less stable.
We're going to find ourselves as a nation entering third world status when it comes to the reliability of our energy system within a decade if we don't get with a different program. And I don't see any inclination now to make hard decisions. I see divisiveness, I see partisan paralysis, I see short-term political time thinking, and I see dysfunctional government.
America may lack consensus on a national climate policy and about building a new energy system, but some states and cities are moving ahead with new ideas and new technologies. Call them laboratories of low-carbon living. Here are 3 examples of communities actively engaged in reducing their carbon footprint. In rural Alaska, trees are harvested from rivers to power biomass boilers, cutting the cost of shipping in diesel, generating local jobs, and keeping dollars in the community.
The community cuts wood and brings it in and everything, so instead of all the money going to the oil companies, it's a community thing now.
Baltimore, Maryland is tapping what some call the 5th fuel, conservation and energy efficiency. Experts think saving energy can cover almost 1/4 of U.S. needs by 2030.
We want Patterson Park neighborhood to be the most energy efficient, greenest, most sustainable neighborhood in the city. And by signing this pledge, you join like 120, 130 other people who've already signed.
In their second year, the Baltimore Neighborhood Energy Challenge saved more than 2 million kilowatt hours and nearly 7% on gas and electric bills. In Kansas, America's heartland, the Climate and Energy Project used federal stimulus dollars to fund 4 prizes of $100,000 to be awarded to the communities that conserve the most energy. That resulted in savings of more than $2 million in 2011, savings that are expected to continue each year for the next decade.
We're looking at energy efficiency and presenting it as a win-win-win because it allows people to save money in their homes, in their churches, in their businesses, in their communities. It allows them to build their local economies because it employs lots of people installing insulation and windows and appliances. And at the same time, it ensures a much more robust and healthy energy future.
But Richard Alley believes that building a clean and sustainable future takes a sustained and national effort.
It took more than 100 years for Schumann's ideas of concentrated solar power to come to scale. It took 30 years for Brazil to develop a national infrastructure for sugarcane ethanol. China needed 6 5-year plans to go from a poor agrarian society to a world leader in clean technology. And the choices we make today will shape America's energy future. And what happens in China and Chicago, India and Indiana will shape the planet. The clock is ticking. The longer we ignore what's needed to move forward with non-polluting energy sources, the more it'll cost in cold cash and a warmer planet. Earth's history and solid physics tell us the climate our kids and grandkids could see if we keep burning fossil fuels and releasing the CO2. But all of us are able to make the plans and choices we know will work to discover and develop new ways of powering the planet. For Earth, the Operator's Manual, I'm Richard Alley.
Powering the Planet. Earth, the Operator's Manual, is made possible by NSF, the National Science Foundation, where discoveries begin. With links to information on climate change and sustainability, online tools to help you save money and energy, educator resources, and much more. Visit pbs.org/ETOM. Powering the Planet is available on DVD and Blu-ray disc. The companion book is also available. To order, visit shoppbs.org or call us at 1-800-PLAY-PBS.